questions on the test from that. I wish they'd update that video because I think it's good. I think it has a lot of merit to it, a lot of credibility to it, but it's outdated and that makes it kind of difficult. Well, the whole point of the video was what we talked about yesterday, that language and meaning are very, very contextual and change from person to person. Did you hear any words on there, any symbols on there yesterday that you hadn't heard before? Young band or anagoglin or schlep, some of those terms. They use schlep on Seinfeld all the time. I heard it there. Elaine uses it quite a bit. That's the first place I heard it. Okay, so let's continue with the chapter and then we'll go over the study guide today. Our plan is, and it looks like everything's loaded and ready, when we get done today, what time did we set that for?
It will be online at 11:45. I always set it a little early.
So by the time we get done today or shortly after, that test will be available to you and I will be available all afternoon. I don't have any exciting plans today, so if you have any trouble, call me or email me and let me know. We're checking this out for the first time to see if that mode of testing will work. And Sean will meet with you after class, talk to you about what we're going to do. Okay. All right, let's continue with the chapter, verbal communication, chapter 5. 3 terms that are discussed in the chapter that are pretty important, I want you to know. And it's important to know the definitions of these terms, but I also, it's going to be important for you to be able to tell these terms apart, to distinguish between these 3 terms. So that means it's probably going to show up on the matching, maybe the fill in the blank. The terms are confirmation, disconfirmation, and rejection. After watching these videos of my lecture, I'm starting a diet today, by the way. Who was that fat old man doing those lectures? Okay, confirmation, disconfirmation, and rejection. Here's what you need to know about these 3 terms. They're very, very important to verbal communication and the transfer of meaning from one person to another person. Confirmation is the positive behavior. Confirmation is the positive behavior. Effective communicators will strive to be confirming with their communication with other people. Confirmation is the positive behavior. You want to be confirming. What confirmation means is that you acknowledge, good keyword to help you, like on the matching part of the test. To match up confirmation, look for the word acknowledge or something that means the same as acknowledge, something similar to that word. Because confirmation, what you are doing as an effective communicator, when you practice confirmation, you are acknowledging the other person, their thoughts, feelings, and ideas. You want to be confirming. It is the positive behavior. Confirmation means that you are acknowledging the other person, their thoughts, feelings, and ideas. Now notice that it's saying acknowledge. It's not saying agree with. It's not saying that you have to like it. It's saying that you acknowledge it. You respond with feedback. You answer their questions. You are acknowledging them. Now, disconfirmation is the opposite of confirmation. Disconfirmation would be the negative behavior. Very, very powerful. Disconfirmation is the opposite of confirmation. It's the negative behavior, and it's very, very powerful. So if disconfirmation is the opposite of confirmation, and confirmation's keyword is acknowledge, what would be a good keyword for disconfirmation?
Ignore.
Ignore. It's going to be the opposite. Great. Ignore. So with disconfirmation, you're ignoring the other person, their thoughts, feelings, and ideas. You're ignoring the other person, their thoughts, feelings, and ideas. Now remember I said that disconfirmation is the negative behavior. It's very, very powerful. And what I mean by disconfirmation being powerful is that we don't like it. Most people do not like disconfirmation. It's so powerful that very often in our culture, we will use it as a form of punishment. We use disconfirmation to punish people all of the time, from a very young age. If you get in trouble in kindergarten or preschool, you do something naughty, what do they do with you? Where do they put you? In the corner, in timeout, right? That's disconfirmation. You're set apart from the others. Don't talk to him, he's in timeout. Don't bother her, ignore her, she's in timeout. That's disconfirmation. We use it as a form of punishment. If you get in trouble in prison, you're in prison and you get in trouble, where do they put you? Solitary, in the hole, in solitary confinement. It's disconfirmation. You're not allowed to socialize with anyone else. You're not allowed to communicate with anyone else. It's disconfirmation. Guys, back me up on this. Women get mad at you and they give you the cold shoulder. It's disconfirmation. You hate that. I do. After a while, it's yell at me. Say something. What did I do wrong? We don't like to be ignored. We don't like that disconfirmation. It's very, very powerful. It's used as punishment in our culture. And yet, very often, with our communication with other people, we are disconfirming. A lot of times we don't mean to be disconfirming. Oh, here's a real good example. Have you ever, like you're walking into Kroger or something, and someone you know or a friend drives by and you wave to them, and they just keep driving, they don't wave back, and you kind of, they probably didn't even see you, but it still leaves you with that weird feeling. Or, have you ever tried to get a hold of your advisor, and they won't return your email, or they won't return your phone call? That's disconfirmation. You really need to talk to someone and they won't return, you know they're getting the messages, but they won't return your calls. That's disconfirmation.
Going on a trip, went down to that board and I started waving at everybody, and about 1 out of 10 waved back.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting when you go to the city too, they think something's wrong with you. If you say good morning to someone as they're walking by, they think you're crazy or something. They're not used to that. Some people get startled when you do it. But if we don't get that confirmation, if they don't respond back, it's awkward. It feels weird to us. Disconfirmation, very, very powerful. Do not, on the test, confuse disconfirmation with rejection. A lot of people will confuse, it's very often confused with rejection. Disconfirmation is confused with rejection. Rejection, if disconfirmation is ignoring and confirmation is acknowledging, rejection is not accepting the other person, their thoughts, feelings, and ideas. Rejection is not accepting the other person, their thoughts, feelings, and ideas. So now you're talking to someone, you're in a meeting, you throw out an idea and that other person says, well, that's stupid, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. That wouldn't be disconfirmation because they're acknowledging you, they're just not accepting. They think your idea is stupid. They think you're dumb. They're making fun of you. They're laughing at your suggestions. Those are all examples of rejection. Or you ask somebody out and they shoot you down. They didn't just ignore you, they rejected you. They're not accepting you or your idea or your thought or whatever it is. Now, in some situations, in abusive relationships, negative relationships, rejection can be a type of confirmation. kids especially, great example of this, because disconfirmation is so powerful, because we hate it so much, as social creatures, we just cannot stand that disconfirmation. We would rather have, in a lot of situations, we'd rather have the rejection than the disconfirmation. Think about little kids. Little kids, if they feel like they're being ignored, you're not paying enough attention to them, they will do something they know is naughty. They know they're going to get in trouble for it because they would rather get scolded, they'd rather get swatted than to be ignored.
My son has oppositional defiance disorder. If that's how he gets his attention, he will do things negative on purpose.
To get that confirmation.
Yep.
To get that confirmation. Now that's an extreme example of what we're talking about, but it happens quite often in our culture, that we would rather be told no than to be ignored. I'm going to confront them at the bank. If they're not going to return my calls and let me know if I've got the loan or not, I'm going to go down there and get an answer one way or the other. I'd rather have an answer one way or the other than to be ignored. Or you've applied for a job and they keep putting you off, putting you off, putting you off. We would rather put them on the spot and get an answer right now, even if it's no, than to be strung along for so long. So what does this mean as effective communicators? That we want to be aware of this and to be confirming in our communication with other people. People ask questions, people shoot out ideas, we respond to that. Doesn't mean that we have to accept it or like it, but we respond to it. We are acknowledging people when they say something. We are confirming to them. We're not ignoring. Very, very powerful stuff. Confirmation is the positive behavior. Disconfirmation is the negative behavior. Remember that disconfirmation is the opposite of confirmation, and rejection is not accepting. Rejection can be a form of confirmation. Rejection is not the opposite of confirmation. In some situations, it can be a negative confirmation. It can be a type of confirmation. It's just negative. Those three terms are going to show up on the test quite a bit, so make sure you have them. Okay, next big list. Really, this is how I'm going to finish up because I covered the last part of the chapter yesterday. Another big list of 7. These are the barriers to effective verbal communication. And I've taken kind of the middle part of the chapter. These are things that get in the way, that keep us from being effective communicators. Why do we have these misunderstandings and these miscommunications? Effective verbal communication. These are things that commonly, typically, get in the way and cause those barriers, cause those problems. And there are 7 on the list. And what I like to do when I present these 7, when I put these on the board, I like to talk about their corrections. Okay, we know that this is the problem. We know this is the barrier. How do we avoid doing this? Oh, gosh, I do that one all the time. How do I stop doing that? How do I avoid doing that? So as I go along, I'm going to try to remember to put a little star by the correction for each one of these barriers. Because quite honestly, as we talk about these, it'll probably remind you of yourself. I know it does me. Habits that I have, bad habits that I have when it comes to communication. So how do we avoid doing that? I'll put the cure or the correction up with the barrier. These are things that get in the way. The first barrier to effective verbal communication, a concept that gets a lot of attention nowadays, is linguistic sexism. Linguistic sexism. Linguistic means language. So we're talking about language. You've heard sexism before. Linguistic sexism is language that prefers one gender over the other. In fact, I think for it to be linguistic sexism, it has to go a step further. It really has to discriminate against one gender. It doesn't just prefer one gender over the other, it discriminates against the other gender. Your book uses the example of actress. as linguistic sexism. And I don't think that fits the second part. I mean, if you're auditioning for a play and they announce the cast, the females are actresses, the males are actors. I don't think that is stereotypical. I don't think it discriminates against the other person. I don't think that's a good example of linguistic sexism. For something to be linguistic sexism, it favors one gender over the other, and it discriminates. It's unfair to the other gender. For something to be linguistic sexism, the word itself has to be a masculine word or a feminine word. The word itself has to be a masculine word or a feminine word. So let me give you common examples of linguistic sexism. Common examples that we hear all the time. Chairman, like chairman of a board. That's a masculine word. The word itself is masculine. Policeman, firemen, all of the congressmen, all of those words are masculine words that are linguistic sexism. So to avoid linguistic sexism, we know that the word itself has to be gender specific. For it to be linguistic sexism, it has to be gender specific. That means it has to be a masculine word or a feminine word. Gender specific. To correct linguistic sexism, and here I'll put my star in, we want to use terms that are gender neutral. Gender neutral. That are not masculine or feminine words. They are gender neutral. So instead of chairman, what would be the gender neutral correction of that term? What do we say?
I would say chairperson.
Chairperson. That's gender neutral. That is the correct term to use in that situation. Instead of policeman, what do we say?
Officer.
Police officer. That's gender neutral. Fireman. Firefighter. Gender neutral. Seems kind of picky, doesn't it? But it gets a lot of attention. If you're going to go out and work in companies, and the radio station several years ago was purchased by Clear Channel Radio, the largest radio broadcasting company in the world. And when they purchased this little group of radio stations in Somerset, Kentucky, everyone that was employed there had to go through and read the employee policy handbook, all of this. There's a whole section on gender equity and avoiding linguistic sexism. Any kind of want ad, anything like that, if we're doing a job listing, that has to be approved by Clear Channel Corporate to avoid these kinds of things, to avoid lawsuits, to avoid any perception of discrimination. It's something that's really, really emphasized. If you look at the want ads, you will notice that you don't see a whole lot of linguistic sexism anymore. If you do, it's usually the smaller mom and pop type companies that will use the linguistic sexism. For example, hotels don't advertise for maids anymore, do they? What do they advertise for? What's the gender neutral? Housekeeping. Gender neutral. That's where that term came from. Restaurants don't advertise. I mean, you don't see Cracker Barrel saying they want waitresses anymore. What do they say? Servers. It's a gender neutral term. So as an effective communicator, working in business, working for a company, you have to be able to identify linguistic sexism and correct it using gender neutral terms. And I keep talking about business and working for a company, but when I was in grad school, I can remember on one specific test that I took, I got points off for using linguistic sexism in my answer on an essay question. And I can't remember what the question was, but my answer was a teacher should always do this, he should. And they circled it and took points off because I used linguistic sexism in my answer. So it's something that is really, really emphasized. This really started being emphasized, I remember it with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan had a terrible, terrible time with this. and his speechwriters were always constantly on him. And it was his generation. It was just then starting to be emphasized, and something that you didn't say you didn't do. And Ronald Reagan had a terrible time with it in his speeches, using gender-neutral terms, training himself to avoid that linguistic sexism. So last summer, on the Chapter 5 test, I gave them extra credit on the Chapter 5 test. I said, if you can give me an example of linguistic sexism that favors women over men. Because in our culture, and I mean every example that I've used except waitresses and maids, every example that I've used has been an example of linguistic sexism that favors men over women. That happens most often. Very few examples, although they do exist, very few examples of linguistic sexism favor women over men. They do exist. But in most cases, it favors men over women. So I asked my class, put it on extra credit on the Chapter 5 test last summer, fall or summer, one of those classes, to give me an example of linguistic sexism that favors women over men. This is what I got. Is that right? Is that linguistic sexism that favors women over men? Why? Because it is gender neutral. Are there male secretaries? Absolutely. That word is not feminine. You may think of a woman when you see that word. The connotative, remember connotative meaning of the word, you may think of a woman, but the word itself is gender neutral. It is not linguistic sexism. I also got this one. Is it linguistic sexism? No, same thing. It's gender neutral. You may think of a woman when you see that. That's your problem. There's certainly men that are nurses. That word is gender neutral. It is not an example of linguistic sexism. My favorite was this one. My favorite. Is it linguistic sexism? No. No. It is gender neutral. So those terms don't fit our criteria for something being linguistic sexism. They are not gender specific. Connotatively, you may have an image of a woman in your head. Connotatively, you may think of a woman, but the word itself is gender neutral. So on the test, be prepared. If I give you an example of linguistic sexism, a gender-specific word, be able to correct that using a gender-neutral term. Could you do that? You need to be able to do that, to recognize it and correct it. Number two, the barrier, this is the negative behavior, is called intentional, and look how I spell it, intentional orientation. Intentional orientation. Intentional orientation, someone that is intentionally oriented, the book says, would live in a world of words, of labels, images. This is what impacts them, influences them, is words and images and labels. And what I mean by that is that they react to words, to images and labels as if they were the real thing. They hear the word conservative and they get angry. Or liberal. They hear that word and they get angry. They have a reaction to that word. They see a picture of, I'm trying to think of a good example. They're a UK fan and they see a picture of a Tennessee player and they get mad. They have a reaction to that picture as if it's the real thing. They see a picture of Hillary Clinton and they get angry at it. Or they have a positive reaction. They react to the word as if it's the real thing. Remember we talked yesterday about people that have hot button words? Words that really upset them. They get angry, they get upset every time they hear that word. They react as if it's the real world, if it's the real thing. People that are intentionally oriented look at a picture and have a real world, real physical reaction to that image. That's being intentionally oriented. Great example. My mother, who was a very, very intelligent person, my mother hated snakes. It was a phobia. I mean, she could not get anywhere near a snake. Hated snakes. Remember the first Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark? When they open the tomb and the floor's moving and his friend says, why is the floor moving? And they drop the torches down there and there's snakes crawling everywhere and coming out. My mom couldn't even watch that on TV. She would get the heebie-jeebies. She could not even look at those snakes. And you could tap on the TV screen and say, look, Mom, they're not real. But she's having that real world reaction to that. That's being intentionally oriented. Remember the movie Arachnophobia with the spiders crawling all over people? And people are having that reaction to them. That's being intentionally oriented. When I was a real little kid, they tore a barn down at the end of our street. And I was out there, as they were tearing it down, I was looking for a snake to scare my mom, that's what I was doing. And I picked up a board, and there was a nest of yellow jackets under that board. And those yellow jackets, they flew up my pant leg. I was probably like 6. They flew up my pant legs, they got in my shirt, they got in my hair. I had real long, bushy hair. They got in my hair. They had to take me to the emergency room to get these bees off me. I went running, trying to run home as these bees are stinging me, and the neighbor's out watering his lawn. He takes off his jacket and starts beating me, trying to get these bees off me. My mom's standing at the kitchen window washing dishes, and she sees the neighbor just wailing on me, so she goes running out. They had to comb the bees out of my hair. They're in my underwear. We found out I was allergic, so it was really nasty for a while. For years after that, I could not look at a picture of a bee in a book without getting sick. I would get sick to my stomach looking at that bee. That's being in, heaven help you if you were in the car and I heard a buzz. I was driving through a field. That's being intentionally oriented, reacting to a picture, an image, a label, a word, as if it's the real thing. And it's easier said than done, but to avoid intentional orientation, you want to be extensionally oriented. Extensional is the positive orientation, is the positive behavior. Extensional orientation, you react to the real world. You react to what you can evidence. What you can evidence yourself. And what I mean by that is that you can experience yourself using your senses. You can see it, you can touch it, you can feel it, you can smell it, you can hear it. That's what you can evidence yourself. People that are extensional orientation react to the real world, to what they can see themselves, what they can experience themselves, and not just to labels or words. That's extensional orientation. Number 2. Okay, number 3 is called allness. Allness, I use know-it-all. Someone that practices allness is like the ultimate know-it-all. Been there, done that. That's what they believe, and that's how they act, and that's how they interact with the rest of the world. Yeah, I can tell you all about that. Been there, done that. They're always telling you what you should do. You know what you need to do. And they're always giving you advice. They've already done it. They know about everything. They can tell you about anything. Whether they're right or not, they're the ultimate know-it-all. They have all the answers. You know what you should do? That's allness. I had a student years ago that was this way, and I was in my office. This was back in Kansas. We had a basketball team, dorms on the campus, and one of the basketball players from Detroit, I think he was, came into my office. He was going to the airport in Wichita to fly home for Thanksgiving. And he came into my office to get directions. He didn't know how to go get to the airport. One of my advisees didn't know how to get to the airport. So I was telling him which way to go down I-70 until you get to Salina, turn on 135 south, and just head straight for Wichita. And when you get to Wichita, I think it's exit 11B, there's a big, huge sign there for the airport. You can't miss it. Just follow that exit. I think it's 11B, and it'll take you to the airport. Well, as I'm saying that, another student is walking by, and he says, no, that's not right. I said, are you sure? And he said, no, it's not 11B, that's not right. I said, well, I was pretty sure it was 11B. It doesn't matter, there's a big, huge sign up there. It shows you where the airport is. You can't miss it. I don't know what the exit is. So the basketball player leaves, and that other student's still hanging around there, and I said, and it's kind of bothering me. I said, are you sure that's not 11B, exit 11B? And he said, no, it's not 11B. I said, well, when's the last time you were there? I thought maybe they changed it or something. I said, when was the last time you were there? He said, oh, I've never been there. He said, but that's be too close to the city. That wouldn't be right. That's not it. He had never been there, but he's arguing with me about what? That's allness. So you can't tell them anything. You will never win an argument with someone that practices allness. You can have all the evidence in the world and you can't win an argument with them.
That's my 15-year-old son.
Yeah, teenagers very often practice allness. Happens all the time. You can have all the evidence in the world. You can supply the data and all the evidence that you need. It doesn't matter. They'll explain their way out. They're always right. They're never ever wrong. You could have Jesus come down and stand alongside of you and tell them that you're right, and they still would find a loophole somewhere.
That's my father.
They know all the
Not at
answers.
all.
They know all the answers. Now what happens, and you know, it's common. We find ourselves coming across sounding like know-it-alls. Occasionally that happens. You catch yourself sounding like one of these people, coming across like you have all the answers. That's natural. I mean, it happens to everyone. These people are pretty consistent. Someone that practices allness, that it becomes an issue with their communication, it's pretty consistent. They do this most of the time. We can't do anything to change their behavior. And one of the most frustrating things about interpersonal communication, we can't change that other person's behavior. We can change it in ourselves. We can avoid it in ourselves. I get so frustrated with myself because those people that practice allness are really great at baiting you into an argument. And you try and avoid it, and then you finally give in and they get you and you think, why did I do that? Why? Because you know how it's going to end. You know what the result's going to be. But they always kind of goad you into this argument, string you along, and finally you get into this argument. It's the most frustrating thing in the world. You can't change their behavior. You can't change the way that they communicate. You can't change their attitude, but you can avoid it in yourself. When you start coming across sounding like a know-it-all, you hear that in yourself and what you're saying. The book says the way to correct that is to use tentative language. What does the word tentative mean? If we're going to go to lunch, I say, where did my erasers go? If we go to lunch tomorrow, and I say, let's go after class, we'll say tentatively 1 o'clock. What does that mean? Around, yeah. It's not absolute. It's not concrete. It could change. And that's what tentative language is. You don't want to be spineless with your communication, with your language, but tentative language allows the other person to add to what you're saying, or even correct what you're saying. It encourages the other person's participation in the conversation. Allness doesn't do that. They're telling you what you need to do. Tentative language encourages the other person to participate in the conversation. Questions are a good way to use tentative language. Do you think it'd be a good idea if we did this? You know, I've been thinking about it. I wonder if it would work if we tried that. where you're throwing it out there and you're asking for their input. What do you think about this? You know, I had a similar problem and I did this. Would that work? Could you do that? That's tentative language. You don't want to, like I said, sound spineless, but you're encouraging the other person to participate in the conversation. That's tentative language. And that's how you would avoid allness. Remember, you can't change the way the other person acts and their attitudes, but you can correct it in yourself.
So the tentative language would be, you said, using language that encourages the other person to...
Encourages a participation from the other person. Questions are a really good example of that. Questions work really well. If you're asked, if it's a legitimate question, and you know people that set you up with questions, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a legitimate question, a sincere question that encourages the other person to answer, to participate in the conversation. That would be a good, appropriate use of tentative language. Seeking their opinion, asking them. Okay? What are we on, number 4? Number 4 is called fact, inference, confusion. Fact, inference, confusion. Do you know what an inference is? If you infer something, if you make an inference about something, yeah, it's kind of like an assumption. An inference is kind of like an assumption, but it goes like one step further than an assumption. You usually have a reason for making that assumption. It's based on something. An inference is like an educated assumption. Inferences are not bad. They're not negative. We make inferences all the time, every day. I've never been hit by a truck, but I still look both ways when I cross the street. Pretty sure it would hurt. We make inferences all the time. We make those assumptions. They're usually based on something, information that we got from somebody else or something we're basing that assumption on. It becomes a barrier. Inferences are not a barrier. They're not a problem. We use them all the time. They become a barrier when we treat them as if they are absolute, as if they are fact. We make an inference and that's it. It's fact. You might be a couple of steps ahead of me. This becomes a problem in relationships when you do this with people. You've heard something about somebody. Somebody's told you about somebody, and you treat that person as if that's absolutely true. How many times does that happen in school? Where someone tells you, they find out who you have for communications class, who your teacher is, and they say, oh my gosh, you're gonna hate him. He's awful. He's terrible. And you go to the class and you kind of like it. The teacher's a good teacher. You like that teacher. Someone that practices fact, inference, confusion, that would never happen. Because they heard it, by gosh, that's it. It's true. They do it with people. They hear something about a person and that's the way they treat that person. They do it with restaurants. I heard that place is terrible. I'm never going in there. They do it with movies. They hear a movie is really, really good. By gosh, that movie's really, really good. Books, whatever. Fact, inference, confusion is you treat it as if it's absolutely true. You haven't experienced it yourself. You haven't tried it, but you've heard that, so you're going to treat it that way. It happens in schools all the time.
So it can be hearsay or gossip.
It can be gossip, absolutely. Yeah. And they hear that, but they treat it as if it's absolutely true. They don't allow for anything different. They don't allow themselves to find out for themselves. So William's in school. He's in the 5th grade. And the 5th grade teacher's in the teacher's lounge drinking an orange pop and smoking a cigarette and talking to the other teachers and just going off about William. Oh, William's a class clown. I can't get anything done. He's always picking on the girls. Every day, the 5th grade teacher's in there talking about William. Well, the 6th grade teacher's in there and hears that. Next year comes around, and the 6th grade teacher sees on his roster William. He says, all right, young man, you come up here, you're sitting up front with me, and treats William as if what he's heard is absolutely true. Doesn't give William a chance, treats him as if that inference were absolute or fact. That is fact inference confusion. So how do you avoid fact inference confusion? You allow yourself to get to know the person. Find out for yourself. Give the person a chance. Keep an open mind with individuals. Get to know them yourself. Fact inference confusion. Inferences are not barriers. They become a problem, they become a barrier when we treat them as fact, as if they are absolutely true. Number 5, this kind of goes along with number 4 too, can cause fact inference confusion. Static evaluation. Static evaluation. Sometimes static evaluation is referred to as the identity of is. Sometimes it's referred to as the identity of is. What does static mean? Anyone have an electronics background? We've heard of static on the radio, static on the TV. What does that word mean? Not what?
Not clear.
Not clear, but it's more to it than that. Static means consistent. So it's consistent, literally, the denotative meaning of the word static means consistent interference. If you have static on your TV, to an electrician that means you have consistent interference, or on your radio. The word static means consistent or constant. Someone that practices static evaluation can't handle change. They don't believe in change. That's what they mean by identity of is. Because something is this way, it's always going to be that way. They expect it to be that way. They can't process change, can't deal with change. Static evaluation is does not allow for change, would probably be the best way to say it. Does not allow for change. Expects the world to be constant and consistent. Expects people to be constant and consistent. They really have a difficult time. They really have a difficult time when things normally, naturally change. They have a very difficult time dealing with that. People moving away, businesses closing down, favorite TV shows being canceled. They can't handle change very well at all. Really disruptive to them. They also see people this way. They are not very forgiving. Someone that practices static evaluation will hold a grudge forever. They don't forgive. If a person was this way, they are always going to be that way. That's static evaluation. It does not allow for change. A leopard can't change its spots. You might have heard that before, that saying before. That's static evaluation. A person can't change. That's what we're talking about. So to avoid static evaluation, you have to allow for change. How do you do that with your language? The book says to date your terms. Date your terms to avoid static evaluation. What that means is that you talk about that person with a reference of time. When I worked with them 5 years ago, they weren't very dependable. I don't know what they're like now. It allows for change. They may have grown up a little bit. When I was in the 6th grade with them, they were a bully. 20 years later, I don't know what they're like now. They allow for change. If you date your terms, you're putting that little phrase at the beginning. I worked with her a couple of years ago. We used to work at Walmart together in high school. You're putting that little time reference at the beginning of your terms, at the beginning of your statement, rather. So the person knows it's allowing for change there. It's allowing for that person to grow up. Maybe that person joined the military and now they're out again and that's changed their life. Maybe they're going to church now. Maybe they went back and got a degree. Who knows what that person's like now? One week I got like 3 calls, reference calls on a person that I hadn't worked with in 5 years. Had not talked to this person in 5 years. And obviously she was applying for a new job and it put me down as a reference. Same week I got 3 different calls. And all I could say was, well, 5 years ago when we worked together, she was a very good worker. She was very dependable. That's dating your terms. 5 years ago she was this. Now who knows what's going on. I want you to know that I can't vouch for her much today, but when I worked with her 5 years ago, she was really good. That's dating your terms. Static evaluation, the identity of is. Number 6 is called indiscrimination. Very similar to stereotyping. Kind of got a long definition, so I'll go slow for you. Kind of similar to stereotyping. Indiscrimination is taking the perceived, indiscrimination, very similar to stereotyping, it is taking the perceived characteristics of a group Indiscrimination is taking the perceived characteristics of a group and applying them to an individual. Indiscrimination is taking the perceived characteristics of a group and applying them to an individual. That's indiscrimination. Very similar to stereotyping. Taking the perceived characteristics of a group and applying them to an individual. Now, who knows what those characteristics are? That's why I have the word perceived in there. We have all kinds of stereotypes, perceptions that we apply to people, so that it really doesn't matter. We take those perceptions and apply them to an individual. So the first thing that has to happen with indiscrimination is you meet someone, you see someone, and you label them. Oh, you're a whatever. Fill in the blank. Has anyone ever done that to you before? Oh, you're from Kentucky? I know what you're like. You know, and they have all these expectations. They have all these stereotypes of people from Kentucky. That's indiscrimination. And they expect you to behave that way. They take it one step further. They label you, oh, you're and because you're going to behave a certain way. You're going to act a certain way. That's indiscrimination. I was a preacher's kid growing up, and people would meet me, happened all the time. They would say, oh, you're a preacher's kid. I know what you're like. I'm thinking, what am I supposed to be like? What are they expecting from me? That's indiscrimination. They label you, we call it pigeonholing in psychology, sociology. The term is pigeonholing. Pigeonhole, they used it back in the old post offices where they would have the little cubby holes, they call those pigeonholes, and mail goes here, mail goes there, goes to this person, goes to that person. That's what indiscrimination, when people are practicing indiscrimination, that's what they do with people. They say, oh, you're one of these, you go over there, you're one of those, you go over there. They label you. They put you in a category or in a group, and then they expect you to act a certain way because you're in that category, because they labeled you that way. And some of these perceptions, some of these perceived characteristics are crazy, but it influences the way that they interact with the world around them. Taking the perceived characteristics of a group and applying them to an individual. Where does indiscrimination come from? Why do people do this? How does it happen? Why do people think, my dad was the Baptist preacher, and he also taught at the college where I taught in Kansas, taught religion classes, was campus chaplain. One year at our Christmas party, the faculty Christmas party, my mom and dad won the dance competition. The Baptist preacher won the dance competition? Baptists don't dance. How can this be? That's indiscrimination. Blew them away. Where does that come from? That Baptists don't dance. African Americans are good basketball players. White men can't jump. Whatever the perceived characteristics are. Where does that come from? How does indiscrimination happen? If I were to take and draw a big circle, that big circle is your field of experience. Field of experience, it's called. In that big circle, represented in that big circle, is everything that you've done. All the food that you've eaten, all the different kinds of food that you've eaten, the books that you've read, the movies that you've seen, the places that you've been, people that you have talked to, music that you've listened to, everything that you have experienced is represented in that big circle, that field of experience. Okay? The effective communicator knows, and I'm going to use a phrase that I used back in chapter 3, I think it was, that our field of experience is directly proportional to our ability to communicate effectively. Our field of experience is directly proportional to our ability to communicate effectively. Do you remember what directly proportional means? What do we mean by that?
If you take away from one area, the other area gets larger.
Right. You can't change one without changing the other. So as our field of experience grows, so does our ability to communicate effectively. We can now talk intelligently about more topics, about more things, because we've experienced more things. That field of experience has grown. But what happens, and most of us are guilty of this, we become really, really good at limiting that field of experience. We don't try new things. We keep that field of experience limited because this is what I like. This is what I'm comfortable with. So we